Arcanum by Khor al-Aran, Chapter 2, Part 2. Yang really would have her head if she knew Ruby was on the outskirts. It was the border between Vale and the outside world, the point at which civilization and security gave way to wildness. For most cities, that was right outside the walls, but thanks to Vale's incredible farmland, the outskirts were a good mile and a half away from the city walls. On the side she was sent to, that meant forest. A whole lot of forest. Forest that could be filled with anything from wild animals to bandits to murderers and wild men. What Yang doesn't know won't hurt her or me. Looking back into the farmland and the city, Ruby brought her hood down, touched the knife on her belt for comfort, and stepped into the forest, the outskirts. It was, as Yang said, where people went when they'd given up. While lands or homes in the farmland were expensive due to the value of the soil you were building on, anyone could afford to live in the outskirts. It was just a case of walking over and building a home for yourself. You had fresh water, abundant wildlife, and plenty of wild foods to forage. It was a life far better than what they had in the slums. And yet, the slums were still packed full of people trying to get by, and for good reason. The outskirts weren't protected. The guards didn't patrol them, and the city didn't hold itself responsible for whatever happened to the people who ignored all warnings and chose to live out here. Ruby was never sure what kind of situation led people to choose such a life. Desperation, probably. The crippled, old, or those who had just given up hope. Ruby didn't expect to find the people she was sent to look for, and so wasn't surprised when she found the burnt-out remains of a wooden shack, timbers still smoldering faintly, and wisps of smoke curling up toward the midday sun. The people were dead then. That much was obvious. Ruby felt bad for them, but they'd chosen to live out here. They'd known what they were getting into. I guess that's my job done anyways. Although, with a furtive look in every direction, she checked the wilderness, looking for any signs of what might have done this. Since there was a fire involved, it probably wasn't wild animals. There were plenty of people who made a living on ending the living of others. Not everyone who came to live in the outskirts did so because they wanted to live normal lives. Some were on the run from the guards, Junior, or one of the other gangs. Those kind of people fell back on what they were good at. Murder. They wouldn't stick around after killing these people, though. They'd take the valuables and run. Which meant the hovel was safe enough for now, and the smoke and fires would keep the animals away. A perfect chance for a little look of her own. Wood and ash crunched underfoot as she crept from the trees and into the clearing, ready to bolt if she saw or heard anything. The home looked to have been a one-room thing with a sloped roof that had fallen inward. It was a ramshackle and simple enough, with evidence of rolled-up skins for beds on one side, and what Ruby recognized was a charred body on the other, its neck bent at an unnatural angle. She swallowed, and tried not to look at that, or imagine what the person might think as she knelt and opened the badly burnt wooden box in the corner. Grave robbing wasn't at the top of the list of things she liked to do, but it wasn't like this person needed his stuff anymore, while her and Yang did. Any valuables she found could be sold off through Junior, and even cloth or food was worth taking. It would just go to the wild animals otherwise. Rummaging through the rather poor scattering of cloth and broken trinkets, she was about to give up until something sparkly caught her eye. Reaching down, she pried off the hidden compartment at the bottom that had become loosened. Something must have bumped into the crate and shaken it loose. There, hidden beneath, lay a small amount of lien, the accumulated savings of the poor soul lay dead only a few feet away. Ruby carefully picked each coin out and counted them. 8, 9, 10, 11? A grin split her face. 11 lien? Almost a good week's earnings, and with another 2 waiting for her back at the guard tower, that made 13. Sure, she'd need to make up an excuse for Yang on how she'd earned it, but bringing back over 10 lien in a single day was huge. Ruby stashed it in her shirt and made to close the box, only to notice something else beneath it. There was a small silver brooch, or it looked silver. It was more likely highly burnished iron or steel, but it was an ornate shape, a long rope or a stylized snake with no head, that wrapped in and out of itself in a figure-8 shape. It looked like there once might have been 2 pretty stones in the sections between, but those were gone. Maybe a clasp for a cloak? She thought, turning it over. It's a little big to be jewelry, almost as large as her hand. Might as well take. Someone will know if it's worth something. Stashing it away with the lean, Ruby closed the box and looked around the rest of the hut. Nothing else looked to be in good enough condition to take, and Ruby drew the line at touching a dead body. Besides, the raiders would have done that already. Patting herself down to get the ash off her knees, she stood and scrambled back to the entrance, excited to cut back and show Yang her winnings for the day. As she stepped outside, a sound off to the right caught her attention. Ruby ducked low and glanced over, spotting an animal of some kind, black fur darting between the trees. She held her breath, waiting for a wolf to come barreling through, and prepared to draw her knife, shout, and sound as loud and scary as she could. That was way too big to be a wolf, though. Heart beating wildly, she scanned the tree line. Wind rustled through plants, and branches bent and swayed. The occasional distant cry of a bird or a sound of pecking on wood reached her, but nothing more. Did I imagine that? Maybe. There was no way an animal destroyed this house and burnt everything down. Killing someone outside, sure, but an animal wouldn't enter a building like this. I'm jumping at shadows, she whispered, still not quite confident enough to speak normally. With her knife in hand, Ruby backed away slowly, eyes darting left and right, but careful to keep the spot she was sure she had seen something at it in front of her. Her legs were turned back, ready to run, and if necessary, to scale the nearest tree. Nothing burst from the brush, nothing sounded or chased after her, or showed its face. The second Ruby reached the trees behind the hovel, she turned and sprinted for the farmland, eyes looking back over her shoulder. 2 pinpricks of red light watched her go. Red eyes? You sure you didn't imagine it? No, well, maybe? Ruby squirmed on the seat in Sergeant Hander's tower. What you're describing is grim, the tall man said. And while I won't be so crass as to say those are a fairy tale, I've seen one in person. I'll say there hasn't been any seen around these parts for over a decade. The Collegium makes sure of that. Her shoulders hunched, and she looked down at the woodwork atop the table. I know. Maybe it was light reflecting off something? Blood, perhaps, Hanner offered, and Ruby was only too happy to take the explanation. If what you say is true, there's plenty of reason for blood to be around. Scavengers might have been attracted to it, which would explain the animal you saw. Crows, maybe, or even a small bear. It hadn't been, she knew. She nodded anyway. You've done what I've asked you to. I'll increase the patrols on that edge of the farmlands, scare off these raiders before they think to try anything. He flicked 2 coins across the table, and Ruby snatched them up despite her nerves. Lean was lean. You ought to keep mention of what you think you saw to yourself. We don't need panic around these parts. Ruby nodded again. She hadn't intended to spread it around, even assuming anyone believed her. Grimm were real. Everyone knew that, but the Collegium was focused on keeping them away from the city, and had done so easily. In 15 years, Ruby had neither seen nor heard of a Grimm coming anywhere close to the city, not as anything other than unfounded rumor or some stupid boast of a traveler. As if anyone who saw a Grimm lived to tell the tale. They were demons, or so the story said, able to rip apart a patrol of armed men with ease. It was the Archanists who kept the city safe, kept all the cities safe, and fought the demons. The Collegium stood as a reminder of that. Why would the Grimm be in the outskirts anyways? And attacking some stupid little hut? It wouldn't even make sense, not to mention they wouldn't set fire to a place. Ruby relaxed a little, the logic taking the fear out, as it often did. There was just no way that had been a Grimm. Hanner was right. She was making it worse in her head. Thanks for the job today, she said, standing and bowing a little. If you have anything else tomorrow, I might be free. Doubt it. Got a farm feud to deal with and patrols to plan. Tell Junior his payment has been made, and I'll catch him up for drinks when I get a chance. And you mind East Wall for the next few days, he added. You didn't hear it from me, but there's been some troublemakers round those parts. We're up in patrols. Captain wants us to make an example and restore the rule of law. A show of force, and judicious beatings for any perceived crime. Ruby nodded and made a note to tell Yang to avoid that part of the slums for a few weeks. Thanks for letting me know, sir. Dunno what you're talking about, lass. I didn't tell you anything. He made a shooing motion. Now get. I've guards to train and farmhands to knock back into order. It was getting late by the time Ruby stepped out, and she made her way back to the walls. While they stayed open all night, the guards on the night shift were notably tenser and twice as likely to do a stop and search. They also weren't above roughing someone down for their hard-earned lean, and the streets were also more dangerous at night. Ruby wanted to get back to Junior's and stash her lean and funny jewelry away before someone decided to take it off her. Ruby caught up with some farm workers coming in after a day's work as she came towards the gates. They looked at her askance, but decided she was a young boy, probably a farmhand, and let her be. Ruby huddled among them as they approached the gates and noticed several people on horseback. There were 4 or 5 of them, 2 of them obviously guards of some kind, with purple cloaks and fancy breastplates. The other 3 wore robes with the hoods drawn up. That wasn't unusual in itself, but the robes were embroidered with gold scrolling and symbols. Archanists? One of the farmhands mumbled, giving words to Ruby's thoughts. What are they doing in the slums? Leaving 'em, another laughed. Not even they want to be in the shithole longer than they have to be. They're just using the lower gate. The Arcanists were talking among themselves, arguing by the looks of it. The 2 guards, who she realized must be Collegium guards, sat silently nearby, letting the 3 go at it. As she passed by, she couldn't help but listen in. Not something to be left to amateurs or those uninitiated. I'm aware that's why we're here. I'm simply saying we could use more people. At least if we enlist the local patrols, we'll have more eyes. There are more miles upon miles of farms out there. This will take days. Hence, why the Grand Arcanist has given us a week. Stop complaining. The first muttered an apology, and the 3 slowly moved their steeds down the path, forcing a few of them to move aside as to not be trampled. The Collegium guards led, stern-faced and silent. Whatever task they were on was one she couldn't hope to understand, and likely one few could. Maybe they were working on the rumored protections that kept Vel safe, or maybe it was some other esoteric and mysterious thing. Whatever the case, it obviously didn't involve the slums, or her. As they passed by, a strange itching burned on the inside of her arm. Ruby winced and scratched under her shirt, then growled and dragged it back to see if she'd gotten a burr or thorn stuck under the fabric. Nothing. Nothing but the tattoo the other Arcanist had left her. It was itching. Badly. Her hand felt her pocket, checking for the cube, afraid that someone had stolen it, and that this might be the spell's way of warning her. It was still there. It was warm to the touch. Very warm. The Arcanist closest to her stilled suddenly and looked back over his shoulder. She caught a brief glimpse of smooth skin, green eyes, and one long black blonde hair. As the Arcanist, a woman, looked down on the collection of farmhands with a critical, almost suspicious eye. Ruby tugged her hood down and kept moving, suddenly nervous. Glinda, one of the others said, drawing the horses to a stop. Is something wrong? Perhaps. The woman turned her horse around, and Ruby's heart skipped a beat. She moved a little faster. You didn't draw an Arcanist's attention. That was just common sense. Having already caught the eye of one, she wanted to avoid a second, especially if it was related to the first. Just keep walking. Just keep your head down. It's probably something else. You there! In the hood! Halt! The farmhands all turned. Several were wearing hoods, the weather turning cold. The guards, too, looking toward the Arcanist. Ruby did not. The second the words passed the Arcanist's lips, she was moving. She darted past the farmhands and by the distracted guards, then cut an immediate left to break eye contact. There was a curse and a muffled yell from outside, followed by the sound of hooves. They were giving pursuit? Seriously? Damn it, damn it, damn it! What had she done? The hooves clattered behind her, but the slums were her element. Ruby leapt up onto a barrel and jumped higher, hooking both hands into a wooden strut sticking out of the side of a building, and hauling herself up to crouch atop it. Not stopping there, she followed the beam back to the building itself and shimmied around the edge of it, ducking low behind a bend in the roof as 2 horses burst into the streets. Not the Arcanist, but the 2 Collegium guards. They brought their steeds to a stop and looked around quickly. One looked up, and Ruby leaned back, surprised that they'd even thought to. Most guards didn't. With her heart in her throat, Ruby leaned over and watched the Arcanist who'd shouted after her stomped in on foot, looking around quickly. She whispered something and made a motion with her hand. A small, flickering ball of light appeared, which she sent spinning around to the other side of the street with a flick of her hand. People rushed to get out of the way, and the light floated around almost like it was searching for her. That was her cue to get out, she decided. Holding her breath and staying low, Ruby crept to the back end of the building and scaled down it, jumping the last 10 or so feet and landing in a crouch. Pulling her hood off, she tossed it into the nearest doorway and stepped into the crowd, blending in and disappearing. The tattoo continued to itch. It was time to get rid of that, and fast. I don't know what to tell you, Max said, stood behind his bar counter with an uncomfortable expression. He looked down on her and placed his flagon on the side. Dark hood, silk, sword, and leather. I know who it is you're talking about, but I've not seen her since that meet you had with her. But she said she would be here for the next 2 nights. She told me I could come back if I wouldn't do the delivery. Ruby looked around the tavern again, hoping against all hope that her eyes and Max were deceiving them, and that the Archanists would be there waiting for her. Nothing. The bar was filled with loud patrons from one corner to the other. The Arcanist was nowhere in sight. That's not what she said to me. You spoke to her? Came up to me after meeting you, he said. Paid for another drink. I was feeling brave, or maybe I was in my cups, and I asked her if she needed to rent a room. I don't know how to say this, but... Mac winced. She said her business was done in Vale. Told me she would be gone before the end of the night. That was last night.